the ground model well enough to support the decisions that need to be made for design, for planning, for insurance purposes. And then how do you convince a client, particularly in these days of economic austerity, to pay for that information? But how do you convince the regulator, who may always be asking for more information, that actually we kind of know enough? So this is a picture of the Centaur impact, which was designed to crash into the moon so that we could study the effects of that impact on the material. Neil Armstrong's boot prints were not enough. We wanted to know more. There's always more that can be known. The question is, do you need to know it enough to pay for that extra information? Just silence my phone. This is a diagram taken from the Fuchs gloss of paper. The diagram was actually produced by a guy called Jeff Pettifer, who did all the fantastic drawings like this that illustrated Fuchs's papers. Now, Jeff taught me industrial petrology. He taught me how to look under a microscope and decide whether a rock was a good aggregate or not, whether it was likely to be susceptible to sulfate attack or not. And in addition, I have no particular interest in horse racing. One of the things we did a lot of was study sands to see whether they would be suitable for all-weather tracks at places like Southall. William Hartman said that if you can't paint something, you don't understand it. While I don't subscribe to the artistic need to actually paint, if you can't visualize a spatial problem in the way that this diagram does, then you can't claim to have understood it and you can't communicate that understanding to somebody else. Some people, of course, do produce paintings of environmental and geological settings. Ramesh Venkatakrishnan works for one of the world's best consultancies, Golder Associates, and he's pioneered the use of genuine conventional artistic techniques in order to communicate some fairly complex 3D relationships here, talking about strike-slip faulting and bedding plane parallel movements. Each one of these images costs, each one of these paintings costs between $5,000 and $6,000, and you can imagine the amount of time that he takes to produce those. Most of us are not Rameshes, and we can't produce work of that quality. So some of the work that we've done is to develop computer software to help us provide that kind of conceptual modelling in a way that those of us who are not artistically gifted can actually use. If you don't communicate that conceptual understanding well enough, then you are in for a surprise. This is the words of a planning inspector who was turning down an application for residential development on a gassing landfill site in Oxfordshire. David Rusdale said, "I have also not seen a conceptual model for the site. Such a model would put the monitoring results into the context of the pathways and receptors on the site and would improve the appreciation of the risks involved. All of the above factors add weight to my opinion on the unacceptability of the risk that I've already identified." And he then went on to reject the appeal, turn down planning permission. So if you don't communicate your understanding of the site well enough, or if you haven't understood the site well enough, and that includes the physical and the social dimensions, then decisions will not go your way. So what kind of information do we need? Designing a site investigation is an art. It's about being imaginative and creative and having a variety of scenarios and testing them by boreholes, trial pits, geophysics, observations. The first ever exercise in my own master's course in engineering geology was to design a site investigation for what is now the Hong Kong airport. And imagine a group of 20, 25 budding engineering geologists, all graduates, all keen, young, eager things, and we totally messed up. And John had to put us right and explain to us how to go around thinking in a creative, imaginative way so that we could actually get the right amount of information without blowing the budget out of the water. How do you know what information you need to know? Well, you need to understand how your engineering structure may interact with the ground as you have it. So if you've got a slope and you want to build properties on top of it, and you've got water at the bottom, it could be a river, it could be in Nepal, or it could be the sea, in the Isle of Sheppey, and the water is eroding away the toe, then the stability of that slope will be compromised. And you're looking at ways of strengthening that slope. If you excavate the ground, then this part of the ground is released from the stress of the material above it and it heaves upwards. The sides lose their lateral support and will expand into the void. Permeability will increase, the stresses will rotate, and water will want to drain out of the material. The shape of tunnels is influenced by the stress regime and by the geometry of rocks, fractures, discontinuities. If you've got homogeneous material like we have in the central part of the London Underground, then nice circular cross-sections are the most stable thing to have. If you're dealing with larger excavations in near-surface rocks, then you would go for an irregular distribution, irregular shape that will allow the stresses to be shed down the sides and absorbed back into the rock mass. If you're loading the ground, then the initial response of this bit of ground is for the load to be taken up by the pore fluids. So the pore pressures will rise and it will squeeze water out sideways. So in the short term you will have instability, but in the long term when those pore pressures dissipate and the ground consolidates, you'll get an improvement in strength. So the takeaway message I need you to absorb is that the engineering geology of the ground is its strength. Under compression, under tension, under shear. Its strength. Its deformability. What happens when you load it, when you try to squash it? Its durability. Will it fracture? Will it dissolve? Will it degrade? And its ability to transmit fluids, water, fuel, gases. Recognizing that the ground is compartmentalized into different zones. So you need to know the boundaries within which those properties are homogeneous. And you also need to recognize that the Earth is dynamic. So what processes are operating on that ground today? Tectonic, climatic, biological, human. And what products will those processes produce? Having understood the ground system, you then need to understand how the engineering will change it. How will it load it? How will it stress it? How will it drain it? And when you've understood those interactions, you can then help inform the design, the planning, the financing of projects. Okay, that's your time. Remember, 9 o'clock next week, back in here for the environmental side of things. Thanks.